Welcome back to the Gridiron Expert. A few months ago, we asked you, members of the GE Nation, what are some of the biggest what-ifs in college football history? What-ifs about games, players, even just individual plays, things that have altered the course of college football history, or maybe just even the history of your team. We sit there and we speculate on these things year-round, but unfortunately, we can never go back to change it. But it is fun to talk about. It is fun to think about. And so today we're kicking off our What If series, and we're starting with what if the college football playoff had started back in 2010? Many of you asked that question. Many of you said, what if the college football playoff had started earlier? And not super early, like year 2000, but let's go back a few years to 2010. What would the playoff have looked like? Would we have had different championship games? Would we have had different national champions? That is what we are taking a look at today. So welcome back to the Gridiron Expert, guys. We're so glad that you could join us. As always, please continue to like, comment, subscribe, share our videos, and check out everything down in the description below because, guys, here at the Gridiron Expert, college football never dies. The season never ends. You'll never have to ask what if about that because the season will never end here at the Gridiron Expert. We want you to become a part of our discussion, the debates, the fun, and just a part of our GE Nation. So let's take a look at this, guys. We know what has happened with the college football playoff since it started in 2014. We're not going to dive into that. We know the playoff is expanding starting next season, not 2023, but 2024, spanning to 12 teams. But what if a 4-team playoff was implemented back in 2010? 11, 12, and 13. Those 4 years. That's what we're going to talk about. So go back to 2010. You look at the 2010 season, it was a fun year, right? A wild season. Let's go back and take a look at those final rankings. The national championship was, of course, between Auburn, led by Cam Newton, and Oregon, led by Darren Thomas and LaMichael James and Kenyon Barner, guys like that. Auburn ultimately won the national championship 22-19 over Oregon, thanks to that wild Michael Dyer run. Whether you believe it was down or not, again, a major what-if there. He was not. And ran the ball down the field, got inside the 20-yard line. Auburn ran out the rest of the clock, hit the field goal, game over. So we have no doubt that if you go back with the playoff system, that Auburn would be number 1 in the college football playoff. Oregon would be number 2. There's no doubt about that. But what about 3 and 4? Who gets in? A lot of guys in the running, right? TCU was undefeated that year in the regular season, but TCU was a member of the Mountain West at the time, not the Big 12. You had Wisconsin, Stanford, Ohio State, and Michigan State all at 11-1 at the end of the season. So that's a crazy thing to think about there. You had TCU at 12-0, and then you had 4 other teams at 11-1, 3 of them coming out of the Big Ten. Who was going to get those final 2 spots? Well, TCU for us would have gotten the 3 seed. TCU would go in at number 3 and would have played Oregon. The Horned Frogs, yes, had a very weak schedule, but they did have a season-opening win over Oregon State, who was ranked 24th in the country at the time. And then late in the year, they went on the road to Utah, who was ranked 6th, and beat them 47-7. That was the statement victory that was like, okay, TCU would deserve to be in the college football playoff. They were led by Andy Dalton at quarterback, averaged over 43 points per game, gave up just a little over 11 points per game. The defense was stout. TCU at undefeated would get in and would have been a group of 5 team to get into the college football playoff. Then the battle for that 4 spot is up for grabs. You give it to Wisconsin, Stanford, Ohio State, Michigan State, all in at 11-1. Stanford, if you look at their strength of schedule back in 2011, it wasn't really 2010. It wasn't really there. So we give the nod to Wisconsin. The Badgers would finally make the college football playoff. Wisconsin gets the 4 seed because if you look at their record, they lone loss on the road at Michigan State, but they did beat number 1 at the time, number 1 Ohio State, by 13 points. Wisconsin also won at number 13 Iowa, the same Iowa team who destroyed Michigan State. So they beat Ohio State, they owned the head-to-head there. They beat Iowa, who beat Michigan State, who was the lone loss for Wisconsin. Strength of schedule-wise, and the way they've been playing, Wisconsin would have had that edge there. So your college football playoff in 2010 would have been Auburn versus Wisconsin, crazy to think about, and then Oregon versus TCU. What a fantastic playoff that would have been. Some great battles there, but we think the national championship would have stayed the same. We think it would have been Auburn versus Oregon. Oregon gets by TCU in a close, high-scoring thriller. Auburn probably takes care of Wisconsin relatively easily. Auburn, Oregon, and we'll say Auburn still wins the national championship, but at least we would have had some good semifinal games there. Moving on to 2011, this was the year that started the college football playoff, right? This was the reason the college football playoff was created, was because of the controversy from the 2011 season where LSU and Alabama, two teams from the same conference and the same division, played for the national championship instead of maybe a team like Oklahoma State getting in there to take on undefeated LSU. Remember, LSU beat Alabama in Tuscaloosa in the regular season, 9-6, the game of the century. Went on to win the SEC. Alabama, that was their only loss of the year. Oklahoma State lost to Iowa State, and Alabama slipped in there as that number 2 team. Pretty controversial. And then Alabama ultimately won the national championship 21-0 over LSU. So you take a look at that. We know LSU's number 1. There's no doubt about that. And to be honest with you, if you look at the records, it doesn't matter who's 2 or 3, right? Alabama and Oklahoma State were so close that year. It doesn't matter the seeding. Alabama and Oklahoma State are going to play each other in the college football playoff. We give the nod to Oklahoma State to be the 2 seed. Bama's the 3 seed. Doesn't really matter. Either way, they're playing each other. So then it comes down to 4. Who is that 4 seed in the college football playoff? It comes down to an 11-1 Stanford team whose lone loss was by 23 to number 6 Oregon at the time. You give an 11-2 Pac-12 champion in Oregon who lost to LSU and by 3 points to USC, and an 11-1 Boise State. That's who it ultimately comes down to. 3 teams there, and one of them the conference champion. But it's ultimately going to be, for us, Stanford that gets in as the 4 seed over the Pac-12 champion Oregon. We've seen this before, right? We've seen it with Ohio State. We have seen it with Alabama before, where the team does not even win their division, does not even go play for their conference championship, but still gets into the college football playoff barely. We even saw it literally last year, where Ohio State got into the college football playoff as the 4 seed to play Georgia, and they did not even play for the Big Ten championship. That's exactly what would happen here with Stanford. 11-1, the lone loss to Oregon. Oregon, yes, a Pac-12 champion, only losses to LSU, the 1 seed, and a decent USC team, but not enough to slip in there. Give us Stanford in the nod, a Stanford team led by Andrew Luck, Stephon Taylor, a team that averaged over 43 points per game offensively. So your college football playoff for us in 2011 would have been LSU versus Stanford, Oklahoma State versus Alabama. What an epic matchup that would have been. Oklahoma State's offense versus Alabama's defense would have been epic. Ultimately, I think the national championship stays the same. I think LSU barely gets by Stanford. That LSU defense was insane. That Stanford offense was electric. I think Stanford, though, ultimately falls a little bit short against that LSU defense. And Oklahoma State and Bama, I think Nick Saban tightens things up in that semifinal game. They take down the Cowboys. So LSU barely gets by Stanford. Bama barely gets by Oklahoma State. Again, 2 epic semifinal games. Alabama wins the national championship. Again, keep in mind the Alabama team, guys, defensively led the nation in every defensive category. That's how good they were. And you can make an argument that their 2012 defense was even better. You move on to 2012. That was a weird year, right? A weird season in 2012. It was across the board. There was only one undefeated team by the time it was all said and done, and that was Notre Dame. A Notre Dame team led by their quarterback Everett Golson and Manti Te'o, the anchor of that defense. Of course, Notre Dame later had to vacate all those wins, but that doesn't matter. We weren't talking about that in 2012 at the time, right? The Notre Dame team, guys, that had wins at Michigan State. They beat Michigan. They beat Oklahoma 30-13 on the road, which was kind of the sign that said, hey, the Fighting Irish are legit here. So you look at Notre Dame, they're the 1 seed because they are the undefeated team with some quality victories, even though 5 of their 12 victories all came by 1 possession, including an overtime win against Stanford and a 3 overtime win over Pittsburgh. 1 loss, Notre Dame's out. Notre Dame is not in the playoff. They're probably not in the national championship in 2012. So crazy to think about there. But because they didn't, the Fighting Irish are the 1 seed. You look at what happened in the SEC championship there. Remember, Alabama and Georgia were playing each other as number 2 and number 3 in the SEC championship. It was basically a national title play-in game, and Alabama won that thriller 32-28 in Atlanta. Georgia wins that game. Georgia's playing in the national championship against Notre Dame and not Alabama, who ultimately won the title over the Fighting Irish 42-14. Wasn't even close. So Bama gets the 2 seed because they won the SEC over Georgia. So Notre Dame is 1. Alabama is number 2. Then you have 2 other options out there. Who gets in at 3 and 4? You have an 11-1 Florida team whose lone loss was to Georgia by 8, but also had double-digit victories over number 9 South Carolina and number 10 Florida State. You have an 11-1 Oregon team whose lone loss was by 3 in overtime to Stanford. And you have a 1-loss Kansas State team who lost to Baylor 52-24 as the number 1 team in the country. So 3 11-1 teams there. 2 spots up for grabs. I think ultimately the committee, and what I would have done is I would have given it to Florida and Oregon, leaving out Kansas State. Sorry, Matthew. I apologize for that. But you look, I mean, Florida's only lost by 8 points to a team that was one play away from going to the national championship game, has quality victories over quality top 10 teams. Oregon's only loss was by 3 points to a pretty decent Stanford team. You can't keep them out for that. So again, you again see another case here where Florida didn't even play for their conference championship and yet still slips in, just like Stanford did the year prior. So your college football playoff in 2012 is Notre Dame, number 1, versus number 4, Oregon, number 2, Alabama, versus number 3, Florida. So you have an SEC matchup there. So basically, Alabama have to play back-to-back SEC championships in a way. And I know many people said they wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have put Alabama having to play an SEC team in the semifinals. I think they would have, as long as it wasn't someone they'd already played. They didn't play Florida in the SEC championship and then had to play them again the next game. They didn't play Florida, so they didn't have to worry about that. They didn't play Florida in the regular season. They didn't have to worry about that. So I do think they would have pitted Bama versus Florida together. What a great defensive battle that would have been. Ultimately, in 2012, I think we finally have a change here. I think Oregon beats Notre Dame. I do think Oregon, led by DeAnthony Thomas and Kenyon Barner, I think Oregon beats a Notre Dame team that was good in 2012, no doubt about it, but clearly wasn't good enough to hang with the big boys. They took down some good teams. Michigan State was 10th. Oklahoma was 8th. I don't think Notre Dame takes down Oregon in that offense. So the Ducks, the 4 seed, go to the national championship game where they play Alabama, who I do think gets past Florida, and we finally get that Oregon-Alabama matchup that we were all hoping to see. We have been hoping to see that for years and years and years, and we never really got it. Now we get it in a national championship for Oregon, number 2, Alabama. It's going to be epic. Alabama still wins. Alabama beat Notre Dame 42-14 in real life. That was the real national championship game. This national title game is closer. Alabama still gets the win. Then you move on to 2013. This was the last year before the college football playoff was implemented, so the stakes were high. Last year of the BCS, who was going to get crowned champion? Ultimately, it was Florida State, who beat Auburn in an absolute thriller in that national championship game. You look at the seeding here. Again, Florida State at number 1, Auburn at number 2. There's no doubt about it. Those are the two guys that played the national title, and they're going to be the same way. Florida State was undefeated with Jameis Winston as their quarterback. Auburn was 12-1, champions of the SEC. They're number 2. Boom. Auburn, the kick 6. That's how they got in, right? They beat Alabama with the kick 6, won the SEC championship, college football playoff. Alabama's in this thing, right? But here's where it gets tricky. Alabama's 11-1. 11-1, didn't win the SEC West. Okay. Michigan State is 12-1. Their lone loss coming all the way back in week 4 to Notre Dame, who was ranked at the time, only by 4 points. A Michigan State team that also beat number 2 Ohio State by 10 in the Big Ten championship game. Then you have 12-1 Ohio State and an 11-1 Baylor team. Lot at stake here. To me, you can't put in Ohio State. Even though Ohio State's one loss, they were undefeated the entire year. Their only loss was in the conference championship game. You can't put them in above Michigan State, who beat them by double digits in the Big Ten championship game. You just can't do that. So Michigan State, for me, gets in as the 3 seed. Michigan State's in as a 3 seed. Why? Because Alabama is not going to play Auburn back-to-back games. We just mentioned that for what could have happened in 2012. They're not going to put Alabama versus Auburn in back-to-back games. It's just not happening. So even though Alabama probably should have been the 3 seed, the committee would not have allowed that to happen. So your matchups would have been Florida State versus Alabama, Jimbo Fisher versus Nick Saban. What a game that would have been. And then Auburn versus Michigan State. That's your 1, 2, 3 matchup there. Because, again, there's no way they're doing an Iron Bowl rematch in the semifinal. If anything, they'd be shooting to get that in the national championship game. Kind of similar to what we had this last year, where Ohio State and Michigan had the possibility of playing in the national championship against each other. Ultimately, though, I think the national championship stays the same. I think that Florida State team was too dang good, guys. I mean, Alabama was great, too. But that Florida State team was on a different level. Jameis Winston and Kelvin Benjamin and a pretty solid defense people don't talk nearly enough about. I think they get past Alabama. Jimbo Fisher finally beats Alabama and beats his former boss well before he does it at Texas A&M. And then Auburn, I do think, kind of mops the floor with Michigan State. That's your national championship. And Florida State wins the title just like they do in real life. So there you go. So what this comes to tell you guys is, what if the playoff had started back in 2010? Well, honestly, I think most of the national titles would have stayed the same. I think we would have had some great semifinal matchups. And, of course, this is all speculation, all on paper. But I think 3 of the 4 years that we just mentioned, the national championships would have remained the same. The only difference would have been in 2012, where Oregon plays Alabama for the national title instead of Notre Dame. But every national champion we just talked about, to me, would stay the same. I still think Auburn wins in 2010, Bama wins in 11 and 12, and Florida State wins in 2013. Then you head into 2014, and we all know what's happened after that. That's what happens if the college football playoff expands. It's exciting stuff. It's exciting to think about the what if of the potential matchups, what if of the potential upsets, the drama that we would have had, the guys that were on the outside looking in. Arkansas was on the outside looking in 2011 and partially in 2010. You had Kansas State in there. You had Ohio State a few times missing out. You had Oregon missing out. You had Stanford in the playoff. I mean, all these teams that were actually contending for playoff berths. That's what kind of makes this exciting and kind of crazy to think about, but also should get you excited for what's to come in 2024. Once that college football playoff expands to 12 teams, you're going to see more upsets. We're not going to have to sit here and speculate the what-ifs. We're going to have great quarterfinal and semifinal matches. We're going to have a lot more upsets, a lot more teams getting in there. It's going to make for a better situation. I can promise you that. But that is a what-if of what if the college football playoff had started at the beginning of the decade, all the way back in 2010. Who knows? But these were the matchups that they would have been, and they would have been pretty dang awesome. Guarantee you better than some of the ones that we've had these last few years. So guys, as always, thank you so much for watching us here at the Gridiron Expert on YouTube. Make sure to continue to like, comment, subscribe, share our videos, and of course, check out everything down in the description below, including our website, thegridironexpert.com. Because again, guys, here at the Gridiron Expert, college football never dies. The season never ends, and we want you to become a part of our GE Nation. And once again, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time right here on the Gridiron Expert.
Yeah.